we live in troubled times, of which the lateness of Philip Davis is merely one small symptom. Terrible things are obviously happening in the country. And I suppose what I'm talking about has some connection with that. It is basically the proposition that we are over-governed. And I take my beginning from the distinction between these words government and governance. I've been struck in recent times by the way in which governance, a word which goes back to 1660, has suddenly become very fashionable. And I think the reason why it's fashionable is that the word government provokes the question, who's governing? How did they get there? What's their legitimacy and so on? Governance, I take it, almost suggests that somehow there are a set of conventions and agreements and rules that operate over an activity, but there's nobody actually responsible for it. So that, I think, is a very sinister development. Now, the text for what I have to say this evening is a famous passage from a historical volume by AJP Taylor. I haven't got the exact words with me, but what he said was that in 1910, the average sensible Englishman hardly noticed the state. He saw red pillar boxes around and a few things like that. Occasionally he might pay a tax, but he didn't need a passport or visas or anything like that. He was almost totally free and people did not interfere with him. That is not, of course, our situation today. Indeed, I suppose in 1910, an Englishman wouldn't have spoken about the state very much. He would have talked about the country. But state was a slightly foreign word that only became more and more current in Britain during the last, I suppose the last half century, or rather more than that. So we are subject to endless numbers of rules and regulations, and my beginning question is, where the devil do they come from? They come, in fact, from all sorts of sources. Now, of course, you and I know one of the most important and troublesome sources of regulations there are. That's the European Union. But nonetheless, they pop up more or less everywhere. For example, residents in a sheltered housing estate in Preston Lancs have just been asked to remove religious artifacts that they might have worn in order to preserve something called diversity. Everybody protested about this, including the Muslims in the area. Or again, British soldiers are told not to shoot Taliban if they see them planting bombs. They are supposed merely to note the spot and report it. Here is an interesting part of a major redefinition going on at the moment, in which war is being reinterpreted as a form of policing action. So I think one of the interests of this question of taking note of the rules and terminology that crops up all the time to justify them is that we begin to see grander processes that are also happening. And turning war into a form of police action is certainly one of them. So let me consider some of the sources of this governance. Firstly, there are international agreements on abstract questions. Some of these are rules of war, like the Geneva Convention about the Red Cross and so on, relating to prisoners of war, or perhaps about diplomacy. For example, diplomats are immune to ordinary processes of law in the country to which they are sent. One of the consequences of that used to be, I don't know whether it still is, that very large numbers of diplomats, almost all, in this case from African countries, never paid a parking fine. one of the interesting things at the moment, or interesting to me, is that the congestion charge is not, I think, paid by American diplomats, who regard it as a tax rather than a fine. And that illustrates very well the way in which, as these rules crop up and as they multiply, all sorts of questions of interpretation arise, requiring the help of lawyers. Much more striking, however, are documents like the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, enforced by a court at Strasbourg. There are very many declarations of rights and conventions covering different sets of people, women, children, refugees, and so on. Again, in 1951, there was a notable convention relating to the status of refugees, and all countries are subject to this, and of course it has become a much bigger issue in this age of migration than it used to be before. Secondly, the United Nations itself is a notable generator of rules and limitations on our action, and it operates both through the Security Council and through bodies such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization, and many others. It has committees. For example, it had a famous and scandalous Committee on Human Rights. Scandalous simply because so many of the member states, such as Libya, which was then the chairman, don't really understand what a human right is, wouldn't recognize it if it were explained to them. They've closed that committee down and created another one, which has almost exactly the same problem, but Libya is not on it, I think. The UN has also established the question of being able to judge whether wars are or are not justified. The terms of its resolutions determine, for example, the problems that David Cameron is having with his rather idiotic foray into Muslim political life in Libya. Again, the fact that the Iraq War is often described as an illegal war is based on a motion of a UN committee. And then, of course, there's our own dear local problem, the European Union. And its expensive problems. Expensive because we pay so much money into it. We got a rebate, of course, with Lady Thatcher. That's perennially under attack, particularly from the French, who think it's now an anachronism and should be given up. At the moment, dozens of organizations in Britain, councils, museums, universities, businesses, and so on, even as Christopher Booker has reported, the Peterborough YMCA have been fined by Brussels to a total of nearly £500,000 for failing to display the EU flag after receiving cash from the European Regional Development Fund. Again, next week, the European Parliament will vote on a resolution from the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, demanding that the European Commission propose legislation including quotas by 2012 for increasing female representation in corporate management bodies of enterprises to 30% in 2015 and 40% by 2020. Excuse me, I'm drying out. Thank you very much. I need, like a lot of the countries in the world, more hydration. So these are, I pluck these examples more or less at random from the newspapers, and you will be familiar with these and many others, of course. And they all amount to telling us what to do and what not to do. Now, the central issue of all this, the reason why it's very important to get it into focus, is that these rules and regulations are almost impossible to repeal. There is slight provision for repealing in the European Union, but with 27 countries, you have to get an awful lot of agreement. And once something is solidified into a rule, it's extremely difficult to change it. Now, that means one of the implications of that is our rather arrogant belief that we get all the rules right, namely that all the laws, the rules, the conventions that we want to impose upon ourselves and upon others, frequently the rest of the world, are things which, at last, we've found the right way of life. I mean, in the past, of course, it's another country and people did not understand things properly, but now we do, and therefore repeal is unnecessary. I mean, how do you repeal a right? When governments are faced with the question, will you sign a Declaration of Human Rights? The answer is almost inevitably, of course we will. Are they not good things? We've enjoyed them all our lives. Now let's extend them. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that I lived without any rights until quite a late stage in life, because I grew up in New Zealand, then I went to Australia, neither of which in those days had rights. And then I came to England, which only acquired rights in the proper sense in, what was it, 1998. So I never had a right until a late stage of life, nor, of course, did I need one. Nor, I think, have you ever felt a deep need for any set of rights, because if you live under the common law, you are in a situation where if people do invade your rights, then you have plenty of recourse. You do not have to appeal to human rights. And that is one of the interesting reasons why the people who mostly exercise these rights today before the courts are convicts in prison or refugee seekers from abroad, or sometimes criminals from abroad. The repeal question seems to me absolutely central, because what it means is that we are accumulating a vast collection of rules under which we have to live. Now, what are we going to do about it as these rules become, and many of them will, of course, out of date, oppressive, impossible? This is a situation that we've been in before, a long time ago. We were in it towards the end of the Middle Ages, when the amount of entail and religious legislation had reached a point that was beginning to strangle the increasingly enterprising aspirations of many Britons of that time, many Englishmen at that time. The question is, how could you deal with this situation? And the answer was the concept of sovereignty. It changed its meaning so that Henry VIII, who was one of the first spectacular employers of this power, is sovereign, but in Parliament. And vile brute though he was in many respects, he recognized that sovereignty, in England at least, was the agreement between the king and the Parliament. The point is that in the Middle Ages, people believed that making law was probably an unpleasant and illicit act of will. So people didn't make laws very much. They already had laws. And if a situation arose in which they didn't know what the rule or the law was, they created an inquest and they discovered what it was. Now, you will no doubt be cynical and think what they discovered was in fact the law they wanted to use, and no doubt you would be right. But nonetheless, it was very important that it's only towards the end of the Middle Ages that the idea of actually making law comes into existence. And the correlate of making law is this creature called a national sovereign. Very important indeed, because what it meant was that England could get rid of all of the lots of these rules that proved to be inconvenient without violating them or breaking them. In a despotism, in most other countries in the world, there are religions and there are customs, and there is a ruler, and the ruler can determine what is a law and what is not, and he can change it. And law is not anything that we would recognize in terms of the rule of law these days. So it was important that we managed to find a way in which we could deal with the problem of law without actually violating the law. So we have now very large numbers of sources of law, ranging from international declarations through the EU, Geneva Conventions and so on, down to Westminster, and of course local government and all the rest of it. Now, all of this means that by contrast with 1910, with 100 years ago, there are too many people trying to run our lives. And the eccentric thing is that today we do actually seem to need more people to run our lives. In other words, the level of incompetence found among English people, British people in general, is remarkably high. This is a rather dim population in which many people cannot stop themselves from littering the country, from simply throwing stuff away. They can't bring up their children properly, so that teachers complain that when the children come to school, they can't tie their shoelaces or don't even recognize what letters are, and so on. So that what we have is a situation, curious situation, vast amounts of regulation of how people behave and ought to behave, and a high degree of incompetence in the conduct people use. Interesting question, which way the causal chain works. Is it the case, for example, that because a large number of people are incompetent, we therefore need more rules? This is the way in which governments tend to operate. That is to say, because these children come to school incompetently brought up by many of their parents, the government mandates notionally beneficial courses in school, in parenting, or in social competence, or things of that sort. So it might be that the incompetence of the population as it increases requires further rules and reports and action by governments. But I'm tempted by the view that it works the other way around in part. The more regulation we have, the more government does things, the more we assume that governments ought to be doing more and more things. And therefore government itself tends to cause this incompetence in our population. I think, in fact, the causal chain works both ways, because there are all sorts of causes, some of them fashion, some of them technological changes, which lead people to be incompetent anyway, and government is simply responding to this. For example, if you have a mobile phone, the virtue of punctuality becomes very much less important. You don't have to be sure to turn up on time, because you can always ring the person and say, I'll be late, or something of that sort. So technology constantly changes the situation that we find ourselves in. Now, a further implication of the world that I'm describing is that we are moving from a moral world into a legal world. When I mentioned the Iraq War, for example, the people who oppose it these days constantly say Blair is involved in an illegal war. Now you might say the war was immoral, they shouldn't have gone in, they shouldn't have done it that way, and so on. All of that, no doubt, is arguable. But what is interesting to me is the way in which legal is now the crunch. That is, it is a word that people take more seriously than moral and ethical in the past. If something is runs against the law, if the United Nations Committee decisions can be regarded as law in the right sense, then that is powerful, and people are very worried about it. Indeed, this is a wider point of the situation I'm describing, because if you have a small number of rules, then you only need a relatively few courts. If you have more and more rules, the number of courts, lawyers, and judges must expand, because the rules keep colliding with each other. And the result is that you need lawyers and judges to make decisions about where the boundary lies. This is often called proportionality. This problem, namely the problem that interpretation is required for many of these rules, is peculiarly acute in the case of rights. You see, a right ought to be, what it means is something absolute as a condition of a decent human life, the kind of human life that we Europeans would take for granted. So it's a very central thing, and when it was being played around with in what you might call the philosophical laboratories of the early modern period, there were only three of them really: life, liberty, and property were the three basic rights which every person thought had to be respected. But as you increase the number of rights, of course, then you have an interesting problem arising. Legal problems certainly start arising in large numbers. For example, how do you combine the right of the state to send criminals back to the country they came from when they've served their sentences with the right to a family life? Large numbers of brutes stay in England these days because they have some sort of claim to a family life, and the judges have decided where that boundary lies. So here we have a peculiarly important nexus between rights and public policy. You see, if you ask, how did we ever acquire a set of universal human rights valid for all times and places? And that's what a right means. Once it's entrenched there, there is in principle no reason it should ever be changed, because it is supremely rational and necessary to human life. But there are virtually no rules and principles of which this can be said. The point is that any rule has to be formulated. It has to be formulated in a language. Languages have implications, and therefore almost any formulation of a rule is going to raise problems. You have a right to life, but what about the death penalty? What about self-defense? There is no right, in fact, which can ever be unambiguously asserted. But the point about these rights, and I suppose it's the point that comes out from the fact that I never had a right until a very late stage of life, is that declarations of rights are really for foreigners. They're for people who don't belong to the West. They are a kind of moral imperialism in which we try to improve the horrible, corrupt, impoverished and despotic societies in the rest of the world who are trying to run what we would call states and exercise what we would call national sovereignty with very varying amounts of success. What we are in fact doing is something that I am inclined to call constitutionalizing rules. That is, the American Constitution is a very slim volume like that. The Indian Constitution, I'm told, is 500 pages long. Nobody, I suppose, has ever sensibly read it. Now, the point about a constitution, in the case of the American Constitution, and we get along without any constitution at all, as I think does Israel and a few other countries, is the constitution simply the rules of the game of politics. If you try and put all those rules down, you're moving out of the sphere of constitutions into the sphere of politics. You're trying to determine what ought to be determined by party discipline and party concerns. Hence, I think, trying to turn laws and rules into constitutions is a good example of the kind of arrogance which we Westerners are exhibiting in relation to the rest of the world. So an ideology, all of this government results, I think, from an elite. It seems to me that as time went on, increasing numbers of people in our society became more or less detached from interests in a clear sense. If you're in commerce, you clearly have an interest and you follow self-interest, and that's fine, as Adam Smith said. But if you're a teacher with lifetime appointment, or if you're a university professor, or if you're a civil servant, there are whole sets of people in our society, an increasing number of them, who are not, whose fate, as it were, does not depend upon their interests. They can therefore afford to indulge themselves in forms of idealism. And one form of idealism is the belief that we should redistribute the wealth of a country in terms of justice rather than in terms of desert. There's a kind of rationality lying behind this, and the basic argument, you see, a lot of these people were tempted by forms of socialism and communism in the past, and no doubt all other collectivist creations like fascism and Nazism and all the rest of them. That's all gone because nobody believes in it anymore. But this is a basic drive in our civilization towards creating a better society. And the new thing that developed out of the 20th century, you can see it coming in some of the arguments in favor of the League of Nations after the First World War. But what became very influential was the idea that nations are selfish, self-interested groups, and that the way to build a better world was to have recourse to a higher international set of institutions, to which, of course, charities have become a prominent part. Charities, international organizations, international bureaucracies, groups like the European Union claiming to have transcended the selfishness of the world that we live in. So there is, I think, a developing ideology which lies behind much of this excessive governance, and it consists in the belief that we must transcend the selfishness built into our individual lives and our selfishness, and that instead of this we should act as good global citizens and be a good model for other countries that don't really understand this. Thank you very much.